What's up guys, welcome back to another video. For today's video I'm going to be doing the genre tag video. I was tagged by Pauline months ago, probably even over a year ago, who even knows at this point, to do this tag. So yeah, I'm going to sit here today and do them. So the first question in this tag is your favourite genres. So I thought we'd start with my favourite genres within non-fiction. Obviously non-fiction can just be the genre on its own, but specifically the types of non-fiction I seem to like are memoirs, essays, and also self-help books. That's just my vibe. And in terms of fiction books, contemporary sci-fi, chick lit, literary fiction. I don't particularly read most things. I'm just not really into historical fiction, fantasy. Those are just not, but those aspects are coming. So number 2 is your least favourite genre. Fantasy. I haven't read like a lot of high fantasy or even like maybe middle fantasy. Is that a thing? I don't know. But the aspects of fantasy that I have read, and just even the thought of fantasy, I'm just like, I don't want to read that. Like I'm not interested in that. So it's just, for me, it's not a genre I'm into. Like I think I lack a lot of imagination when it comes to like the descriptions of like buildings and castles and stuff that they include in fantasy. Like even reading Harry Potter as a teenager and like as a child, I enjoyed reading Harry Potter, but there were aspects that went over my head because I couldn't really imagine them, you know, like the swinging staircases and stuff. Actually, that's a lie, the swinging staircases I could imagine. But for me, it was actually really good to see the films, even though I never finished watching them. Till this day, I don't think I've seen the last 2 Harry Potters, but it was good for me to see the film to actually see like what the school looked like, because my imagination was just lacking. So things that just require a lot of like description of like buildings and it being gothic and stuff, I'm not really here for it. I feel like fantasy has a lot of things that I need to sort of be imaginative for, and they're not within like sort of my actual real life experiences. Like I can't read a book about dragons because like where's the dragon? Where have I ever seen an actual dragon? So I'm just a bit like no. And yeah, things to do with magic and stuff like that, I don't hate them or anything like that, and I don't mind them for like other people, but for me I'm just like, that's not a thing. So yeah, like Harry Potter is probably the most amount of like books that I've completed that involve that sort of wizardry and magic and that sort of element, because well, I was a child and Harry Potter was cool at that point. So yeah, my least favourite genre is definitely fantasy. I read, what's it called? It's up on my Kingdom of Souls by Rena Barron. I started to read that, did not finish it because I just wasn't interested in it. The fantasy element was annoying and all this magic was happening, which wasn't too bad, but I was also having issues with the actual like book. And also young adult is not a genre that I'm that into, if I'm honest with you. I know it is all the rage on BookTube, and this isn't about like insulting people and being like, you're an adult, you need to read adult books. I'm not that interested in reading books about teenagers. Like when I was a teenager, probably more interested in reading them then, but even then I wasn't that into them, simply because I felt like a lot of YA was American based. Like when I was a teenager, I was getting all my books from the library. I thought a lot of them were very American based, so they just something I couldn't relate to. And sometimes when you read YA and these like Americans are having amazing lives, you're just like, womp womp womp, that's not my life. And yeah, now I'm just simply not interested in any of that. I read Let Me Hear a Rhyme earlier this year and I really liked it. I actually liked it so much, not so much that I want to listen or read more YA, but in the sense that it was nice to see like sort of this is the sort of way YA has been developing, because I can just so imagine that, you know, if you're really into hip-hop and things like that and you live in maybe in these New York boroughs that they were talking about, stuff like that, it's really nice to see yourself represented. But for me, I'm like not a child or a teenager, so I'm just like, whilst it was very nice to read and I feel like so good for teenagers and stuff who are going to get to read this, it didn't really do much for me, but it was a really good book. I actually thoroughly enjoyed it, but again, it's not going to make me want to read more YA. Like I just generally have no interest in the genre, which is funny me mentioning YA and fantasy, because the Namina Fauna series is a fantasy YA book. Boom. And for me, at least, that's a sort of example of when it's done well, because whilst these characters are teenagers, they're not in America, they're not in the UK, they're not even, yeah, it's not populated, well, it is on Earth, but it's not dedicated to a specific country. Actually, it's in West Africa, so there you go. But it's not really about teenage life. You know, there's an aspect in there of teenage love, but other than that, the sort of features or components of, you know, what I feel like usually makes up YA is not in there. So I can read that regardless of all the other, these two genres that I don't actually really like. But I do like that book. But I also know that it doesn't encourage me to want to read any other fantasy books because I'm not here for it. I mainly actually went for this because of the black representation in it, and the POC representation, I guess, as well. So that's why. But it's not going to turn me into a fantasy buff, which is weird because with sci-fi I was like, oh, I don't like sci-fi, I don't read sci-fi, whereas I read a lot more sci-fi now. Still might be on the soft side of sci-fi, but that I'm more inclined to like take a step forward more into the genre and read other aspects. Fantasy, it's not going to happen. So number 3, a genre you want to try, and I'm gonna say like horror or like crime, like procedurals or something like that. I was gonna also add thrillers, but I've been reading a bit more thriller as well in the beginning of the year. I want to read like maybe some more horror just to see, I guess, what that's about. I think I struggle with horror in the same way that perhaps I struggle with fantasy, and that is the imagining aspect. I'm also a bit like, how can a book scare me? You know, some things can be creepy, I completely get that, but yeah, I would just like to read some horror to just see like what people are writing, what kind of things are included in the genre, what do people write about. So I do think I want to read like Lakewood by Megan, I can't remember her surname, I think that's a sort of horror thriller book, I don't really know. But yeah, that's a genre I definitely want to try. And what was the other one I said? Like crime procedurals. Yeah, so I read like some cozy detective stories, and they're quite nice, but it'd be maybe a bit more nicer to dive into the sort of crime aspect. The thing is with that, I kind of know how I feel about that in relation to like thrillers. They just have a certain point for me where I think I can only ever really give them 3 stars. I like them, but I'm never like completely blown away by them. And they all seem quite depressing. Like there's always a detective who's drinking so much and stuff like that. Like I did used to read quite a bit of that. Like as a teenager, I say quite a bit. I'd pick up books here and there, and just from those books, I was just like, I'm not really that interested in this genre because everyone seems so depressed. This atmosphere is always dark, and it's always just like, especially if they're set in England, it's always just like people in like middle class villages who are super depressed with their lives, and it's just like they can be asked with their kids. Not they can be asked, but their kids piss them off so much, and their husband just pisses them off so much that something happens to the kid and they don't notice for ages, and then all this suspicion falls on them. So yeah, I want to try a bit more of that just because I have been reading like cozy detective stories, just I don't know, to see. But obviously, like despite the fact that they're sort of about crime, even though they're about cozy crime, they just come at it from different angles, and I just feel like cozy mysteries at least have a better atmosphere. Like everything is not so doom and gloom, despite the fact that there are gruesome murders happening. So number 4, a fantasy you don't want to try. Oh, so you see that how I read that wrong, so you already know the answer to that. A genre that you don't want to try, which is fantasy. Like I've already tried it, but there's no other genre that I can really think of that I'm like, I do not want to try that because it's just not in my mind. Like I just wouldn't pick it up. But I'm sure there are plenty like genres that I just wouldn't pick up. But I can't really think of them. And you know, when you go to genres, like I will use Goodreads because that's like my place. So yeah, when I'm in Goodreads and I look at their sort of genres, what's it got here? Manga. Okay, I wouldn't read manga, to be fair. Paranormal, probably wouldn't read that, but I just said about wanting to read horror, so maybe paranormal horror has a little bit of a crossover. Religion, I don't really read books of a religious nature, so perhaps that is actually a genre I wouldn't want to try. But yeah, none of these are really genres I wouldn't want to try. I'm just not interested in trying them. Yeah, I probably wouldn't want to read manga though. Doesn't seem like something I'd be interested in. Number 5 is a genre you're not sure about, and I put here historical fiction. The reason I say this is because I always say I don't like historical fiction. I find the majority of books that are talked about in terms of historical fiction or like shown, I'm like, why on earth would I want to read that? But then there have been some favourites of mine that are classed as historical fiction. The number one that I can think of, which obviously is also like myth and retellings and stuff like that, is The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller. But I also did enjoy City of Girls by Elizabeth Gilbert, and that's a historical fiction book. I requested it as an ARC for NetGalley, and that's because of the author, so I was prepared to overlook the historical fiction aspect. But it's definitely one that I'm not sure about because whilst I have favourites in that genre, I don't know. I feel like it's gonna be so bad, but I just don't want to read books about like World War One, World War Two. Why would I want to read that? So yeah, it's just one that I'm not sure about. There have been books that I liked in it, but you know, obviously I know within historical fiction there are so many eras and you can just find the era that you like and just stick yourself in there, but I'm just not that interested in the past, if I'm honest. Like, just not interested in these sort of people like prancing around in like whatever fancy gear. And I know that's not all there is to historical fiction, but as a genre, it really doesn't appeal to me unless I've heard about a certain book that has other themes in it that I know I'm gonna like. But overall, it's a genre that I just like to stay away from. Number 6 is a genre blend that you love. And for me, that is fiction, which is usually women's fiction, chick lit, and food. I am here for books that mix this. That's my jam. I freaking love it. Like, I just love when people have their book and they have a character who absolutely loves cooking. So the character, like, you know, gets home from a long day at work and whips together something from like the 3 things that they have in their fridge. Okay, maybe 5, but you know, I'm so here for that. And you know, I think my love for that really developed from like reading books like Pear Shaped from Stella Newman. She has a whole bunch of Leftovers by Stella Newman. She has like a whole bunch of books that really just focus on that theme. And around that time, like, I read a bunch of other ones as well. But one book I'm really excited for, I think it's called Adobo and Arsenic, and it is a mystery book, but also blends in the sort of food element. And I really want to read that. The Stella Newman books I do love, especially because they are set in the UK. So I do feel like when she's talking about waitrose in other supermarkets, like, I can relate so much. Obviously, I think it's Adobo and Arsenic is set in the US, I imagine. But I am interested in that blend of genres. But yeah, I have like recently gone back to looking for more sort of fiction books that are based around food and women, because that's just my jam. I really love eating and I love hearing about like what other people are cooking. So that is a genre that I'm here for. So the final question, number 7, is a genre-defying book. Now, I remember watching Pauline's video where she spoke about this, and I think she couldn't tell whether it was genre-defying or genre-defining. And the original video has since been taken down, so I don't know the actual explanation for this. So I'm just not going to answer this, because whichever way it is, I don't actually have an answer for this question, like a genre-defying book. Like, I don't know. And I think one of the things is, whilst genres are wonderful for sort of classifying things, and you know, it's good to know like what you do like. For example, like, even though these shelves are bare, like a lot of these books are science fiction books because they're all my boyfriend's books, and this is just a genre he loves, you know. I just tend to read whatever I want, like pick up whatever I want, and that just ends up mainly being literary fiction, if I'm honest, which surprises me because I just wouldn't ever think that. But yeah, it just ends up being that. And yeah, I don't really think in terms of genres when I go to pick books. I just read the back of the book, and if I like the sound of it, I will pick it up. At least that's what I used to do in the library. And now, like, it's either recommendations from BookTube or perhaps recommendations from Goodreads, but I take those with a pinch of salt. And then, yeah, just wherever, like, I sort of hear books from. I follow a lot of, like, publishers and stuff like that, so it's always nice to see when they release new books, and I sort of get new sort of recommendations from there. So yeah, I don't really think in terms of genres anyway that much that I could actually, like, even answer that question if I knew, like, which side of the question it actually fell on. But that is a genre book tag, and that is all about me and genre. So yeah, please don't come for me about YA or fantasy, because, you know, I feel like I redeemed myself slightly by books that I had read that contain both of those elements. But that does not mean that you will find me delving into fantasy or YA very much. I actually remember I did a video maybe like 2 years ago, because it was when I'd set myself like some reading goals, and one of my reading goals was to read a fantasy book, and then I just flopped because, like, I don't know if I started one and then was like, no, this isn't for me, if I just didn't do it because I was that apprehensive that I was just going to be bored to death. I was like, I'm just not doing this anymore, and then I ended up changing the goal. So that's where we're at, guys, and that's probably where we're always going to be at. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. I don't actually know who to tag, so what I will do is just tag people in the description box. So yeah, open the description box to see if you have been tagged. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll catch you in another one. Bye.